The village of Larkspur Hollow had always taken pride in being precisely the kind of place where nothing unusual ever happened. Nestled between gentle hills and framed by hedges that seemed to have grown specifically to please postcard artists, it was a place where the loudest event of the week was usually the clatter of Mrs. Fenchurch's cat knocking over the milk bottles again. The villagers liked it that way. Predictability gave them comfort. Stability gave them purpose. And gossip, well, gossip gave them life. If you love mysteries filled with whispering villagers, hidden clues, and endings that strike when you least expect, make sure to subscribe and turn on the bell. Miss Marple has many cases to solve, and you don't want to miss the next one, which made the annual Summer Twilight exhibition at Graymore House all the more important. Miss Lavinia Graymore, the last of a once grand family, insisted on hosting the event every year, claiming it was her duty to cultivate culture in a place where the most sophisticated thing some people read is the jam label. No one argued with her, not because they agreed, but because Miss Lavinia was formidable in the way only elderly women with perfect posture and steel gray curls could be. This year's exhibition was particularly anticipated. A new portrait recently restored after decades locked away was to be unveiled. It was said to depict Miss Lavinia's long-deceased relative, Arabella Graymore. A woman whispered about in old village tailies with that delicious mixture of fascination and unease that only the long dead can inspire. Miss Marple, having been invited through the well-meaning meddling of her friend Mrs. Weatherby, arrived at Graymore House just as the evening sun dipped low, casting elongated shadows across the manicured lawns. She walked with unhurried grace, greeting those she recognized. Mrs. Pennington Smythe, who was loudly insisting she'd once met a duke. Mr. Graves, the mild-mannered local historian who adored anything older than himself. Nora Bell, the anxious young maid whose eyes darted like nervous sparrows. Inside, the great hall was arranged with small tables of strawberries and pastries, with lanterns casting warm, flickering light across the portraits lining the walls. Each guest wandered, murmuring polite comments about brushwork and lighting. It was all perfectly ordinary, perfectly civilized, perfectly Larkspur Hollow, until the clock struck midnight. Miss Lavinia, standing proudly beside the shrouded new portrait, tapped her cane sharply against the floor. "Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you Arabella Graymore." She pulled the velvet cloth away with theatrical flair. A murmur rippled across the room. Several women sighed. Mr. Graves adjusted his spectacles. Arabella's painted face stared out with a mixture of sorrow and quiet defiance. Beautiful, haunting, and startlingly lifelike. Miss Marple stepped forward slightly, examining the portrait with mild curiosity. She noted the details: the delicate lace at the collar, the turquoise pendant resting at the subject's throat, the eyes painted with unsettling depth. A fine artwork indeed, though something about the expression tugged at her instinct, like a loose thread waiting to be pulled. And then it happened. A single streak of moisture glimmering under lantern light slipped down the painted sheet. Someone gasped. Someone else dropped the pastry. "P-L-A-T," Mrs. Pennington Smythe shrieked, declaring it a sign, possibly even a curse. Young Nora Bell covered her mouth and took a stumbling step backward. Miss Lavinia went rigid, her knuckles whitening around her cane. "Ridiculous," she barked. "The paint, it's simply the varnish settling." But her voice trembled. Miss Marple, quietly observant as ever, noticed three things at once. The streak on the painting was too clean, too deliberate. Nora Bell looked absolutely terrified. And Mr. Graves, usually calm to the point of boredom, was pale as linen, staring not at the tear, but at the pendant in the portrait. The guests crowded closer, whispering theories in a storm of frantic murmurs. "It's a trick. It's condensation. It's supernatural. No, it's sabotage. Someone must have tampered with it. Miss Lavinia commanded silence, though her voice quavered under her usual authority. This is nothing but a chemical reaction. Arabella is not weeping, for heaven's sake. But even as she spoke, another tear formed slowly, unmistakably, and slid down the opposite cheek. The room erupted. Only Miss Marple remained still, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly as she watched the reactions, not the portrait. Human behavior, she often said, was far more revealing than anything painted on canvas. Within minutes, the exhibition collapsed into chaos. Guests insisted on leaving. Miss Lavinia's indignation hardened into fear. The local constable was summoned, muttering something about pranks and nonsense. And through it all, Miss Marple noticed the tiniest tremor in Nora Bell's hands. The way Mr. Graves avoided looking at the portrait, the faintest shadow of satisfaction flickering across the face of one guest, she could not yet place. By the time the hall emptied, the village was buzzing with rumor. Some claimed a curse. Others suspected an intruder. One particularly imaginative group insisted Arabella had returned from the dead to reveal a family secret. Miss Marple, however, knew better. Art did not weep without reason. Someone, somewhere, wanted it to appear that way, and whatever secret hid behind that painted tear was about to unravel the peaceful fabric of Larkspur Hollow. By morning, Larkspur Hollow had assumed the appearance of a village under a slow, persistent cloud. The sky itself seemed to conspire with talkative tongues. A thin mist clung to hedgerows and slipped along the lanes as if eavesdropping. People who had hardly spoken to one another in years exchanged hurried, conspiratorial words. The tear on Arabella Greymoor's painted cheek had been the subject of every kettleside conversation, every errand and parish meeting. Miss Marple listened to none of it at first. She preferred to learn by watching the watchers. Still, she enjoyed, as most people did, the little frisson that came with being privy to community unrest. At the post office, Mrs. Dalloway declared, in tones thick with enthusiasm, that it was surely a sign from beyond. My aunt's sister's neighbor's cousin had the very same thing happen in Buckminster, she announced, as if the geographical stretch lent her tale credence. Mr. Hames, who kept the general store, mused that someone must have mastered a new sort of paint. You can't trust restorers, he sniffed. You never can. Mrs. Pennington Smythe, who had fainted at midnight and recovered with dramatic speed, announced to anyone who would listen that it was proof of long-buried sin. Arabella always had enemies, she said, and Greymoors have had enemies for generations. A small group clustered round her, savoring the delicious scandal as if it were a slice of forbidden cake. At Greymoor House, Miss Lavinia received visitors in a manner which attempted composure and largely failed. Friends were offered tea and reassurances of scientific explanations, while enemies, few and more careful, were reminded that Miss Lavinia's family had given much to the village and expected proper gratitude in return. Yet the portrait hung silently in its private sitting room, now closed off with a polite sign and a stout iron gate across the doorway, an action that did less to calm curiosity than to make it boil hotter. The vicar, disturbed by the chapel clock's quiet anxiety, visited the house and found Miss Lavinia pacing with a hand at her throat, as if to hold in breathless indignation. It's theatrics, he offered mildly. People love a spectacle. Miss Lavinia fixed him with a stare that could bend spoons. Not when it's of our dead, she said. Meanwhile, the Constable Evans, a man who took comfort in procedure, wrote a careful note in his pocketbook and arranged for a guard to watch the portrait until a forensic expert could be consulted, should one be required. The word sabotage had already been uttered and would not soon be forgotten. For the more practical-minded, the hypothesis of trickery settled like a plausible rug over the messy things that gossip preferred to conceal. Rumors, however, do not confine themselves to plausible rugs. By afternoon, speculation had braided itself into conjecture about motives. Arabella Graymore, once rumored to have broken hearts and fortunes with equal ease, had left an estate tangled in resentments. A few villagers hinted only half in jest that perhaps the portrait wept because someone had stolen something precious from her long-dead bosom. Others suspected the painting's tears were directed at someone still alive, and so the fingers of suspicion began to point at Nora Bell. The maid who had been present when the cloth was drawn away found herself at the center of whispers. She was young, nervous, and worse in the village's eyes, recently seen speaking in private with Mr. Graves. The sight alone rendered her suspect enough for many. People remembered a dropped plate, an indignant murmur, the tilt of her head. In small communities, small actions are magnified until they become evidence. Mr. Graves, who was thought to spend his nights curled in with obscure tomes and the company of dead men, also attracted attention. He had been the one to catalog the Graymore archives and had access to sealed family papers. After all, it was his face that had gone pale at the sight of the pendant in the portrait. Who, villagers wondered, might he be protecting himself, the deceased, or some secret he had unearthed? There were other more personal accusations. The wealthy and solitary Mrs. Fenton, who had been known to court Mrs. Lavinia's favor, was observed by more than one person smiling with a look some interpreted as satisfaction. Had there been rivalry, financial or otherwise? Perhaps. Old jealousies die hard in narrow places. Miss Marple, reading the tea leaves of sentiment in the village, perceived how quickly character was repurposed as culpability. That, she had found through years of observation, was a most reliable human trait. When people wished to find a reason for discomfort, they would quickly recast acquaintance as evidenced at tea with Mrs. Weatherby. Miss Marple heard the tailies in collage. Mrs. Weatherby, practical and precise, listed who had been at Graymore House the previous night and whose hands might have been near the portrait. The restorer, newly hired, Mr. Thomas Reed, a painter who had been seen consulting outside the grounds 2 days prior. Nora Bell, Mr. Graves, and a solitary, unidentified figure glimpsed near the conservatory in the half-light. Each name became a bead on the gossip string, threaded eagerly through conversation. For my part, Mrs. Weatherby concluded, it's either an elaborate trick to sell the house people love a haunted Graymore or a message. Someone wanted it to weep. She peered over her spectacles at Miss Marple. What do you think, dear? Miss Marple did not offer a tidy theory. Instead, she remarked, as she often did, that people were like apples when a worm entered, all the neighbors noticed by the one bitten. We mustn't assume the portrait is the important thing, she said gently. Rather, why should anyone wish it to appear important? That was the question she planted among other speculations. The villagers mulled it. Some read it as a deflection, others as a challenge. Miss Marple, however, had already made her own preliminary observations. The neatness of the streaks, the pendant that Mr. Graves had glanced at, Nora's trembling hands, and a faint smell she'd noticed that did not belong in the air of a varnished portrait room. It was the kind of smell that belonged to someone who had been frightened, an acrid tang of nicotine and coal dust. And yet, Nora did not smoke by late afternoon. A new current entered the village. The arrival of the newspaper reporter from the county town. He stayed only an hour, scribbled excitedly, asked questions with a hint of appetite, and left with promises of a striking lead the next morning. His presence sharpened tempers and spread the story beyond the HEDEROWS as evening fell again over Larkspur Hollow. The village was restlessly alive. People locked doors a little earlier. Curtains were drawn with a little more care. Conversations dipped and whispered as neighbors passed. All the while the painted Arabella rested behind closed doors, her cheeks dry in the light of day, but remembered as wet in the village imagination. Miss Marple, seated by her own small lamp, made a little note in a small book, not of accusations, but of impressions. It was not yet time to conclude. She liked to let the village talk itself into revealing what it wished to hide. Secrets, she knew, had a way of unraveling when people became convinced of their own versions of truth. For now, the village had reacted predictably. It had chosen a villain, fashioned theories, and settled into an uneasy ritual of suspicion. Miss Marple's only certainty was that the truth lay elsewhere, subtle, human, and waiting behind a triviality that others would mistake for insignificance. Morning came with a crisp breeze threading through the chimneys of Larkspur Hollow, carrying with it the lingering unease from the night before. Though the village no longer buzzed with the same frantic urgency, a deeper tension had settled, quieter, sharper, and far more dangerous than gossip alone. The constable had made his rounds, Miss Lavinia had shut herself away, and the villagers had begun returning to their routines with the determined air of people hoping that normalcy might pretend away their fear. Miss Marple, however, knew that nothing so peculiar would be forgotten so easily. She began her morning with a slow walk to Greymore House. Miss Lavinia had written her a brief, somewhat prickly note. "If you insist on involving yourself in this matter, Miss Marple, at least come directly to the source, rather than collecting rumors like a sparrow collects crumbs," which Miss Marple suspected meant that the woman was secretly grateful for her interest. Pride rarely let people say so plainly. The drive leading up to the house was lined with tall yews, their shadows stretching across the gravel like dark fingers. A housemaid one of the younger staff opened the door with a curtsy and explained that Miss Lavinia was waiting in the morning room. Miss Lavinia rose at once as Miss Marple entered, her cane planted firmly before her, her expression drawn but composed. Her steel-gray curls seemed even sharper today, like a helmet of resolve. "I suppose I should thank you," she said briskly. "You at least have the sense to approach this intellectually rather than hysterically, unlike half the village." Miss Marple smiled pleasantly. "I'm sure people are simply worried, my dear. Fear can make even sensible people fanciful." "Humph," Miss Lavinia muttered. "Let us hope your sensibility is as reliable as your knitting needles." She led Miss Marple through the corridor toward the sealed portrait room. The constable stationed outside tried to look authoritative, though he stood rigid, as if unsure what exactly he was guarding. When the key turned and the iron gate scraped aside, the air inside was cool and faintly tinged with varnish. The portrait, illuminated by a high window, looked entirely ordinary, beautiful, sorrowful, still. No tear marks, no moisture, not even a smudge upon the varnish. Miss Lavinia puffed her chest. "You see? Whatever happened was merely some chemical nonsense reacting to the lantern heat. The rest was hysteria." Miss Marple stepped close but did not touch the painting. She merely leaned forward, her pale blue eyes tracing the edges of the frame, the canvas texture, the pendant painted upon Arabella's chest. The turquoise stone, she noticed, had been rendered with remarkable care. Enough care that even Mr. Graves's brief, startled reaction made more sense now. "Has the portrait been moved recently?" she asked gently. "Of course not," Miss Lavinia snapped, then hesitated. "Well, the restorer did bring it out from storage 3 weeks ago. A dreadful man. Too fond of his own voice." "I see," Miss Marple murmured. She noted something else, the tiniest patch of residue near the lower edge of the frame. Not paint, not varnish, something that glinted faintly when the light hit it. She said nothing. Miss Marple never interrupted a story before she had heard all of it. She found Mr. Graves in the Greymore library, poring over a stack of brittle documents. His spectacles were perched precariously on the end of his nose. His fingers moved with the reverence of someone touching relics. When she greeted him, he started so violently that a small puff of dust escaped from the nearest book. "Oh, Miss Marple, I didn't see you. You seemed absorbed," she said kindly. "Family papers?" He swallowed, hard. "Yes. I was cataloging them for Miss Lavinia before the exhibition." "There are?" "Quite a few." His eyes flickered toward the portrait room's direction. "You reacted rather strongly to the pendant," Miss Marple said. Her voice mild, as though commenting on the weather. Mr. Graves reddened. "It was nothing. I was only surprised by the accuracy of the restorer's work." Miss Marple tilted her head. "An accuracy that frightened you?" He dropped his gaze. It reminded me of something. Something I came across in the archives. Nothing important." Miss Marple filed that away with the same efficiency she filed knitting needles. In perfect order for later use, she found Nora outside the servants' entrance. Wringing her apron so fiercely, it looked as though she hoped to strangle the cloth. The moment she saw Miss Marple, her eyes flicked with fear. "I didn't do anything, ma'am," she blurted, before Miss Marple had uttered a word. "I swear I didn't." Miss Marple's tone remained soft. "My dear, I never said you had." Nora crumpled onto the stone step, her shoulders shaking. "Everyone's talking, saying I must have touched it, or done something to make it cry. I didn't. I only helped remove the cloth. I didn't even look at it for longer than a moment." "Then why are you so frightened?" Miss Marple asked gently. Nora swallowed, because she had seen something. Miss Marple could tell, not the tear. Something else. "I can't say," Nora whispered. "If I say it, it'll make everything worse." "Worse for you?" Miss Marple murmured. "Or worse for someone else?" Nora looked up, startled. "Please, ma'am," she whispered. "Please don't ask me." Miss Marple laid a comforting hand on her arm. "Very well. Not yet." But her instinct sharpened. Nora was hiding something not for her own protection, but for someone else's. And the fear in her eyes was not the fear of guilt, but of danger. Before leaving the estate, Miss Marple made one last stop, the little temporary workshop behind the stables where the portrait's restorer, Mr. Alec Turnbull, had spent the last month. He was a tall, slightly disheveled man, with the air of someone who believed himself misunderstood by Philistines. "What happened last night was theatrical nonsense," he said, waving a paint-stained hand. "Paintings don't cry. People do." "And yet," Miss Marple said, "something did appear on that canvas." He snorted. "Probably a trick of humidity. Or someone tampered with it after I left." He paused. "Not that I'm accusing anyone." He clearly was. "Did you move the portrait at any time?" Miss Marple asked. Turnbull stiffened. "Only to restore it. It required cleaning. A lot was hidden beneath the old varnish." "Anything surprising?" His eyes flickered. "Depends what surprises you." "And the pendant?" Miss Marple asked casually. Something cold darted across his expression, but all he said was, "Beautiful detail, isn't it?" By the time she stepped back outside, the sun had risen high, bathing the hedges in gold. The village, just beyond the gates, bustled with forced normalcy, children skipping, men trimming hedges, women leaning toward one another with murmured speculation. Miss Marple walked slowly, her parasol tapping lightly in rhythm. She now had a frightened maid, a historian hiding something, a restorer who had touched the portrait more than anyone else, a family secret buried in old papers, and a tear that appeared only when an audience watched. Each clue was small, trivial, seemingly unrelated. But Miss Marple knew better than anyone that human motives always hid in the smallest details. The trick was to wait. People revealed themselves if one listened long enough. And Miss Marple was a very, very good listener. By the following morning, Larkspur Hollow had done what it always did when faced with mystery. It isolated the most convenient suspects and wrapped them neatly in suspicion. Even before the constable made any official remarks, two names had risen to the surface like bits of cork in water: Nora Bell, the trembling maid, and Mr. Graves, the historian whose pallor had not escaped even the least observant villagers. Nora Bell was accused because she was young, nervous, and had been close to the portrait at the moment of unveiling. Mr. Graves because he had reacted too strongly for a man who prided himself on scholarly restraint. Both were easy choices for a population that preferred tidy explanations over the discomfort of uncertainty. Miss Marple spent the early hours moving quietly through the village lanes, her aim not to interrogate but to observe. Observation, she knew, was always a more reliable teacher than accusation. Constable Evans found Nora in the small servants' courtyard behind Greymoor House. She looked dreadful, eyes puffy, cheeks blotched, hands twisted tightly in her lap as if holding herself together by sheer force. Evans cleared his throat in that officious way of his. Now then, Nora, some people say you were the last one near the painting. You didn't see anything strange before the unveiling? No dampness on the canvas? No marks? No, Constable, she whispered. I swear I didn't. You didn't touch it, even by accident? No. Miss Marple, seated slightly apart on an iron bench, watched the girl's face. Fear, yes, but not the fear of someone caught in wrongdoing. It was deeper, an inward fear, directed at something yet unsaid. Nora's eyes darted to Miss Marple, just for a moment, before returning to Evans. Evans sighed. We must clear you or confirm suspicions, you see. Nora swallowed. Suspicions? Heavy ones, Evans said with unnecessary gravity. Some folks think you might have done something to make the portrait appear to cry. Nora burst into tears. Miss Marple leaned forward gently. My dear, she said softly, no painting weeps unless someone intended it to. And you don't strike me as a girl who would wreck her livelihood for such a cruel prank. Nora sniffed, wiping her face. I wouldn't, ma'am. I swear. I didn't even want to be near it. Why not? Miss Marple asked, her tone light, almost offhand. Nora froze. Evans perked up. Yes, why not? Nora looked at the ground. I can't say? You've said that before, Miss Marple replied kindly. And it only makes one wonder whom you're protecting. Nora's fingers twisted tighter. I'm not protecting anyone. But her eyes betrayed her. Miss Marple made a mental note. Nora is frightened, yes, but not of guilt. Of someone else. The village found Mr. Graves in his usual haunt, his cramped little office at the Larkspur Historical Society, the windows clouded with dust as if history itself were exhaling upon them. He was sorting stacks of old Greymoor documents, though his hands trembled slightly when Miss Marple entered. Good morning, she said cheerfully. He looked up, startled. Oh, Miss Marple, I didn't expect visitors. Miss Marple was not fooled. You've been expecting someone, she said mildly. Your eyes keep glancing at the door. Graves flushed. It's just nerves. After all that talk, and after your unfortunate reaction to the pendant? Miss Marple asked gently, as though inquiring about a lost glove. He stiffened. I told you, he said weakly. It reminded me of something in the documents. And did that something relate to Arabella Greymoor? Graves pressed his lips together. I cannot say. Miss Lavinia entrusted me with private papers. Miss Marple nodded. Of course. But private papers do not explain why you looked at that pendant as though it were. What is the term? A ghost from the past. Graves dropped his gaze. His fingers twitched over a sealed envelope buried beneath other files. Miss Marple did not look directly at it, but she noticed. "Tell me, Mr. Graves," she said calmly. "When the tear appeared, did it frighten you because it was supernatural, or because it confirmed something you already knew?" Graves's throat bobbed in a hard swallow. He looked ill. "I need more time." "And I," Miss Marple said softly, "need only more truth." By noon, Constable Evans had already made his decision. Nora Bell. "She's the simplest explanation," he told Miss Marple as they walked back toward the village. Young girl, impressionable, might have been dared or persuaded, might have wanted attention. "It happens." Miss Marple smiled in that gentle way that irritated Evans terribly. "My dear Evans," she said, "you're assuming complexity belongs only to older minds. Young people can have secrets too." "And Mr. Graves?" Evans said skeptically. "A respected historian?" Miss Marple's reply was calm. "Respectability is often a costume, Constable, and some costumes are worn for many years before the seams begin to fray." Evans frowned, unsure if she meant Nora or Graves or someone else entirely. Miss Marple continued, "You're choosing between two people simply because they were nearest to the portrait. But nearness does not equal guilt." Evans huffed. "Then who do you suggest?" Miss Marple paused. "I suggest," she said softly, "that the most obvious suspects are rarely the correct ones, especially when fear is being used as a tool." Just as the constable left, Miss Marple noticed something, or rather, someone moving along the hedge near Graymore House. A figure ducked behind the shrubs, then stole away toward the path leading to the old conservatory, same direction someone had been seen on the night of the unveiling. Miss Marple did not quicken her step. She simply watched, and the faintest glint caught the morning light, a metallic glimmer on the stranger's hand. A key? A locket? Or perhaps something more dangerous? Miss Marple tucked her notebook back into her handbag. The obvious suspects were merely distractions. The true suspect had just revealed themselves, not in guilt, but in fear of being discovered. The afternoon sun slanted through the lace curtains of Miss Marple's sitting room, scattering gentle patterns across her teacup. Though her hands moved calmly knitting needles, clicking with reliable precision, her mind was sharply elsewhere. She replayed each expression from the morning. Nora's trembling silence, Mr. Graves's evasive panic, Miss Lavinia's brittle dignity, and the shadowy figure slipping through the hedges. Something threaded them all together. Something tiny, almost dismissible. And yet those were precisely the sorts of clues Miss Marple trusted most. Just as she finished her row of soft blue yarn, a knock came at the door. Mrs. Weatherby entered, cheeks flushed from brisk walking. "My dear Jane," she burst out before even sitting, "the whole village is in a state. They're saying Nora might be arrested." Miss Marple's needles paused mid-air. "Arrested?" She echoed mildly. "Well, not officially, but the constable's been prowling about, and people are talking as if it's a foregone conclusion." Mrs. Weatherby fidgeted. "I know you don't like to interfere, but perhaps you might." "Well, help prevent something foolish?" Miss Marple set her knitting aside. "My dear," she said gently, "there is little as dangerous as a village convinced of its own certainty." Mrs. Weatherby sighed in agreement. "I knew you'd say something wise. Now do come." "Miss Lavinia is beside herself." Miss Marple rose, smoothed her skirt, and fetched her parasol. It was time to look again properly. At the scene of the trouble, Constable Evans reluctantly allowed her entry. "But only a quick look," he insisted. "I'm waiting for the county inspector, and I don't want anyone tampering with things." Miss Marple smiled warmly. "I never tamper, Constable. I merely observe." She stepped inside. The room was hushed, yellow light pooling through the tall window, illuminating the painting's somber face. Arabella Graymore's eyes seemed deeper today, less sorrowful, more knowing. Miss Marple walked closer, but not directly toward the canvas. Instead, she knelt beside the base of the frame. Ignoring the constable's baffled expression, there it was again, the residue she had noticed before, dried now, faint but unmistakable. A thin, translucent sheen at the bottom edge of the frame, not paint, not varnish, not condensation, a different substance entirely. Miss Marple dipped the tip of her gloved finger against a minuscule speck, brought it close to her nose, and sniffed delicately. Yes, she recognized it. Sugar. Not loose sugar, but the sticky remnant of a sugar-based syrup, and there was only one reason. Syrup would be anywhere near a painting. Miss Marple leaned back. Thoughtfully. Someone had dripped a mixture likely sugary, likely transparent onto the portrait in such a way that it would appear as a tear when warmed by lantern light. A simple trick. A child's trick, almost, but executed with purpose. Yet it was not the syrup itself that drew Miss Marple's deeper interest. It was something else, stuck to the residue, so small the constable hadn't noticed. It was a single, tiny fiber, barely visible. She plucked it delicately and held it toward the light. A thread. Soft, very fine, cream-colored, with a faint scent clinging to it, a scent Miss Marple knew extremely well from decades of quietly observing people. Lavender talc. The kind used almost exclusively by older ladies who preferred traditional toiletries. Ladies-like. She paused, not yet completing the thought. Instead, she asked the constable, "Tell me, Evans, was the portrait touched by anyone after the unveiling?" "No one," Evans said firmly. "Not a soul. I locked the room myself." Miss Marple nodded. That meant the fiber came from someone present during the unveiling, someone who had been close enough for their clothing to brush the bottom of the frame. But who? Nora wore coarse cotton, Graves dark wool, Turnbull a paint-smeared canvas apron, the guests a mixture of silks and satins, none matching this texture. Except one, Miss Lavinia. Miss Marple remembered her clearly, that night dressed in her elegant cream gown, dusted with lavender talcum powder she had used for years. Her dress had brushed the frame when she removed the cloth, but Miss Lavinia would never sabotage her own exhibition. Would she? "Evans," Miss Marple said softly, "I believe you may be barking up the wrong tree." The constable frowned. "Meaning?" "Meaning the portrait did not cry, not by accident, nor by supernatural force. Someone prepared it to do so, and the person who prepared it was present at midnight, very close to the frame." Evans scratched his head. "So Nora?" "No," Miss Marple said firmly. "Not Nora. Graves?" "Not him." Evans looked helpless. "Then who the devil was it?" Miss Marple stood, folding her gloved hands neatly. "I do not yet know the motive," she said, "but the clue is quite unmistakable." She let the small fiber fall into her palm. "The person who tampered with the portrait," she said quietly, "was an older woman, one who wears lavender talc." Evans blinked. "Older woman? In that crowd? That narrows it down to half the village." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed, "which is why we must now understand the why of the matter. For sabotage does not occur in a vacuum." She replaced her gloves and stepped toward the door. "But mark my words, Constable, the portrait cried for a reason. Someone wanted it to cry. And until we learn what secret that tear was meant to reveal, we cannot know whose hand guided it." And with that, Miss Marple left the portrait room, her eyes bright with understanding. The first real clue had been found, but it was far from the last. Miss Marple left Graymore House with a slow, thoughtful step, her parasol tapping lightly across the path. The tiny fiber in her glove, the cream thread, dusted with lavender talc, felt weightier than a stone. Not because it proved guilt, but because it hinted at a long-hidden motive wrapped in silk and secrecy. Lavender talc, Miss Marple knew, was not merely a scent but a signature subtle, distinct, and deeply personal. In Larkspur Hollow, secrets did not stay silent forever. They accumulated, layer upon layer, like dust on a bookshelf. And today, the dust was ready to be disturbed. When Miss Marple reached the village green, she found Miss Lavinia herself, marching toward her, cane striking the path with the force of a commander. "Miss Marple," Miss Lavinia snapped, "I hear you've been rummaging around my house again." "Not rummaging, my dear," Miss Marple assured her gently. "Observing." "Well, observe something else," Miss Lavinia huffed. "This nonsense must stop. People are implying I orchestrated some dramatic spectacle, as if I would humiliate my own family legacy." "Miss," Marple noted her trembling hands. "I never implied anything of the sort," she said calmly. "Miss." Lavinia stared at her, searching, battling, something unsaid. "You're digging, Jane," she muttered. "You always dig." Miss Marple's voice remained kind. "Only to uncover truth. You are not the only older woman who wears lavender talc, after all." Miss Lavinia's face blanched. "I'm done discussing this," she barked, turning sharply. "You forget yourself." But Miss Marple watched the stiffness in her shoulders, the quickening of her step. Miss Lavinia was frightened, and frightened people often hid guilt or the knowledge of someone else. S. Later in the afternoon, Miss Marple visited Mrs. Weatherby's cottage. She had barely stepped inside when a crash sounded from the kitchen. "Oh, heavens," Mrs. Weatherby gasped. Rushing forward, Miss Marple followed with a calm gait. Inside, Mrs. Fenton, wealthy, widowed, always impeccably dressed, stood amidst porcelain shards, her gloved hands shaking. I didn't see it," Mrs. Fenton stammered. "I'm so sorry, dear. My mind is elsewhere." Mrs. Weatherby fussed politely, sweeping the shards away. Miss Marple studied Mrs. Fenton's pale face. Her gloves were cream-colored satin, fine, expensive, and faintly dusted, with lavender talc. Miss Marple approached gently. "You're troubled, my dear." Mrs. Fenton's chin quivered. "Everyone is troubled. This whole affair is grotesque." She inhaled sharply. "They're questioning Nora. Poor girl. She wouldn't harm anything." "Yet your concern is not for Nora alone," Miss Marple murmured. "Is it?" Mrs. Fenton's eyes widened. I don't know what you mean." "Secrets," Miss Marple said softly, "have a way of breaking us, dear. Much like porcelain." Mrs. Fenton's eyes flickered downward. "Some secrets are not mine to tell," she whispered, "and yet they weigh upon you." Mrs. Fenton blinked hard, tears threatening. "What do you expect me to say? That Arabella Greymore was no saint? That her portrait deserved to weep? That Miss Lavinia hides more than she reveals? Everyone in this village hides something." Miss Marple touched her arm. "Lightly, but some hide more than others." Mrs. Fenton looked away. Another older woman with lavender talc. Another connection. And yet Miss Marple felt the truth tugging her elsewhere. Mrs. Fenton had fear, but her fear was diffused, general, emotional, not fixed on a single threat. Miss Lavinia's, however, was sharp, directed. At dusk, Miss Marple visited the Historical Society once more. She found Mr. Graves sitting rigidly at his desk, staring at a sealed envelope. He looked up with haunted eyes. "Miss Marple," he whispered, "I can't keep this." He pushed the envelope toward her. Inside was a copy of a very old legal document, an inheritance codicil. Miss Marple scanned it quietly. At the bottom, a name had been crossed out heavily, but the ink underneath was still faintly visible. Arabella Greymore. Next to it, written in a different hand, "Disputed claim. See attached witness statement." Whose claim? Miss Marple asked. Mr. Graves swallowed hard. "A child's," he said. Arabella had. A child? No one knows. The statement was hidden away. Someone wanted it forgotten. Miss Marple's mind whirred. A hidden child. A dispute. A legacy. A motive for deception even decades later. And who wrote the witness statement? She asked. Mr. Graves hesitated. Finally, he whispered, Miss Lavinia's mother. Miss Marple felt a cold thread of clarity wind through her. The Greymoor legacy was not as polished as the paintings on its walls. As Missy Marple left the society, she found Nora Bell sitting on the church steps, hugging her knees, looking both frightened and determined. Miss Marple, she whispered, I must tell you something. Miss Marple sat beside her. Nora's breaths came quick and thin. I didn't tell the constable because I knew they'd blame me. But I swear I saw someone near the portrait before it was unveiled. Miss Marple turned gently. Who? Nora's voice shook. A woman, she whispered, dressed in cream. I thought it was Miss Lavinia at first, but she moved differently. How differently? Quicker, smoother, and smaller. Nora swallowed. It was Mrs. Fenton. Miss Marple felt the pieces shift and realign. Mrs. Fenton. The talc. The brushing against the frame. Did she see you? Miss Marple asked. Nora shook her head. No. She left through the conservatory door. The same door where Miss Marple had seen a shadowy figure the day before. Miss Marple's thoughts sharpened. Mrs. Fenton had lied. Miss Lavinia had hidden something. Mr. Graves had found something. Nora had seen something. And above them all, Arabella Greymoor, long dead, had left a legacy tangled in secrecy. As the church bell tolled 8, Miss Marple rose. Her parasol tapping thoughtfully. She now knew. The portrait wept because someone wanted it to draw attention. The person who doctored it wore lavender talc. 2 women fit that description, Miss Lavinia and Mrs. Fenton. Nora had seen Mrs. Fenton near the portrait. Mr. Graves had uncovered evidence of a hidden child, connected to Arabella. But the one missing piece was motive. Why now? Why the tears? Why the deception? Miss Marple knew one thing with certainty. Truth was being dragged deliberately out of the shadows, and whoever dragged it wanted something to rise from Arabella's past. Not revenge. Attention. Recognition. Night fell over Larkspur, hollow like a velvet curtain, soft, quiet, deceptively gentle. But beneath the calm, something stirred. Secrets, when threatened, do not sit still. They lash out. They tremble. They defend themselves. Miss Marple sensed this long before the village did. She felt it in the strange stillness of the evening breeze, in the hurried gait of townsfolk heading home early, in the uneasy silence that replaced the usual chatter outside the tea shop. Trouble, real trouble, always created a new rhythm in a village. And tonight, it beat like a drum no one wished to acknowledge. Just past 9 o'clock. The drum sounded. Miss Marple had just settled into her chair with a cup of warm milk when she heard it, a sharp, panicked cry slicing through the quiet. Then another. Then the frantic clang of metal on stone. She set down her cup at once. Trouble had arrived. Moments later, Mrs. Weatherby burst through Miss Marple's gate, breathless and wide-eyed. Jane, you must come quickly. Something dreadful, absolutely dreadful, has happened at Greymoor House. Miss Marple rose at once, fastening her cardigan. Show me. They hurried down the lane, the shadows stretching long beneath the flickering street lamps. As they approached the estate, they saw lanterns bobbing, figures gathering, and the constable rushing across the gravel path toward the stables. The air crackled with fear. Mr. Alec Turnbull, the portrait's restorer, lay sprawled on the floor of his workshop, half conscious, bleeding from a wound at the back of his head. His paints lay scattered, his tools overturned, and the strong odor of turpentine hung thick in the air. Constable Evans crouched over him, muttering anxiously. Mrs. Fenton stood nearby, pale as chalk. Miss Lavinia hovered on the opposite side, cane trembling in her hand. Nora sobbed quietly near the doorway. Miss Marple stepped forward, eyes sharp. "What happened?" she asked softly. Evans stood, scratching his head. "Looks like someone attacked him. He was alone in here, working. Next thing we know, there's a crash, and he's out cold." Miss Marple glanced around the room. The signs of a struggle were subtle, not wild, but deliberate. A broken jar, a knocked-over stool, and on the floor, near Turnbull's right hand, a piece of torn fabric. Miss Marple bent carefully and lifted it. Cream satin, with the faintest scent of lavender talc. She said nothing. Not yet. Instead, she approached Turnbull as he groaned awake. "Mr. Turnbull," she said gently, "can you hear me?" His eyes fluttered open, dazed, frightened. What happened?" He croaked. "That is what we wish to know," Evans said gruffly. "Did you see who struck you?" Turnbull blinked, tried to sit up, winced in pain. "It was." He struggled, shook his head. "I don't know. A figure. Someone came in quietly. I turned, and then darkness." Miss Marple watched him carefully. This was truth confused, but genuine. Turnbull did not seem the type to stage his own attack. He was frightened, truly frightened, but there was more. His eyes kept drifting toward a locked drawer near his desk. Miss Marple stepped closer. "Were you protecting something?" she asked softly. Turnbull's breath hitched. Evans frowned. "What does that mean?" Miss Marple opened the drawer. Inside was a bundle wrapped in cloth. Turnbull groaned. "Please don't." Evans pulled it out and unwrapped it. Inside lay a second portrait, unfinished, cracked at the edges. Darker, older, rougher, but unmistakably Arabella Grey Moore. Yet this portrait was different. Her expression was not sorrowful, but terrified, and around her throat, painted with chilling realism, a rope. A collective gasp fell across the room. Mrs. Fenton swayed slightly. Miss Lavinia let out a stifled cry. Miss Marple leaned close to the painting. The signature at the corner was faint, but legible. L. Graymore, not Miss Lavinia, her mother, the woman who had written the witness statement. Miss Marple's voice was soft, but firm. This portrait was never meant to be seen. Turnbull swallowed. "I found it behind the paneling when I was restoring the other one. I knew Miss Lavinia wouldn't want it revealed. I meant to tell her truly I did, but someone else found out first." Evans stepped back. "And attacked you for it?" Turnbull nodded weakly. Miss Marple's eyes swept the room. Miss Lavinia, trembling. Mrs. Fenton, pale and rigid. Nora, staring in horror. Graves nowhere in sight, but the torn cream satin in Miss Marple's hand told its own story. There had been someone here, someone desperate, someone willing to silence this man to keep the past. Buried. The portrait of Arabella with a rope at her throat was not merely scandalous. It was evidence, and someone feared evidence. Deeply. As Turnbull was carried away to the infirmary, Miss Marple stepped outside for air. The moon illuminated the hedges, silver and sharp. Mrs. Weatherby approached quietly. "Jane, what does it mean? Why would there be another portrait? And who could have done this to Mr. Turnbull?" Miss Marple tapped her parasol gently. "It means, my dear," she said softly, "that the tears on the portrait were only the beginning. Someone wished to shift attention, to create a spectacle before a far more damning truth emerged." Mrs. Weatherby paled. "About Arabella?" "Yes," Miss Marple murmured. "And about someone who feared what Arabella's true story might reveal." She tucked the torn satin into her handbag. The attack was not random. It was a warning. Mrs. Weatherby gasped softly. "A warning to whom?" Miss Marple looked at the gates of Greymoor House, where two figures watched from the shadows. One tall, one smaller, both too still to anyone, Miss Marple whispered. Who dares to speak the truth? As the last lanterns dimmed, Miss Marple pretended to walk away, but paused at the corner of the hedge. Two voices drifted to her, hushed, urgent. You were supposed to burn it, a woman whispered sharply. I couldn't, another voice hissed. She would have known. You fool, the first voice snapped. If Jane Marple guesses if she puts it, together everything will come undone. Miss Marple held her breath. The voices froze, and hurried footsteps scampered off into the night. Miss Marple stepped out slowly. She knew the voices. She now knew the truth, and she knew exactly where this dangerous path was leading. The tears on the portrait, the lavender talc, the frightened maid, the hidden child, the second portrait, the attack, the secret meeting. Miss Marple breathed in the cool night air. There wasn't one deception, there were two. The true killer, the one behind both the weeping portrait and the attack, was weaving a far older, darker lie than anyone else suspected. The village thought the mystery was about Arabella Greymoor, but it wasn't. Not really. It was about someone living, and someone desperate to keep the past dead. By morning, the village of Larkspur Hollow awakened to news of the attack on Mr. Turnbull. It spread fast and wild, like a spark catching dry hay. Some insisted it was a burglar. Others, more dramatically, claimed the curse of Arabella had struck again. But most quietly murmured a far more unsettling thought. Someone in the village had tried to silence him. Miss Marple, meanwhile, had slept hardly at all. She spent the early dawn hours sipping wheat tea, knitting her steady rows, and thinking deeply. The two whispered voices she overheard were burned into her memory, as familiar to her as faces she had watched for decades. But knowing the truth and proving it were very different matters. She needed a test. A gentle one. A psychological one. One the guilty would fail without realizing. Miss Marple had always believed that people revealed themselves most clearly when they thought they were safe. And so, she decided to make someone feel very, very safe. Miss Marple sent polite invitations, under the guise of discussing the dreadful events of the past night, to four people. Miss Lavinia, whose pride masked trembling fear. Mrs. Fenton, whose cream gloves and lavender talc lingered in Miss Marple's mind. Mr. Graves, who knew far too much about the Greymoor papers. Nora Bell, who witnessed more than she had dared admit. Constable Evans, looking increasingly overwhelmed by the entire affair, agreed to attend as well. At 10 o'clock sharp, they gathered in the Greymoor drawing room, stiff and uncomfortable. The morning light shone in long bars across the carpet, turning dust motes into tiny floating stars. Miss Marple sat at the center, serene. Thank you for coming, she said pleasantly. I thought it would be helpful, given all the confusion, to speak openly. Miss Lavinia scoffed. Openly? About what, pray tell? Miss Marple smiled. About Arabella, and the portrait, and the truth. A shiver went through the room. Mrs. Fenton's gloved hand twitched. Mr. Graves stiffened. Nora swallowed hard. It had begun. Miss Marple nodded to Constable Evans. He stepped forward awkwardly with a covered frame. The cloth was lifted. Gasps filled the room. There, in harsh daylight, lay the second portrait, Arabella Greymoor, with terror in her eyes, and a rope around her throat. Miss Lavinia clutched her cane. Where did you find that? In Mr. Turnbull's workshop, Evans said. Hidden behind a drawer. Mrs. Fenton's gloved fingers tightened. Mr. Graves, pale. Nora whimpered softly. Miss Marple leaned forward. Mr. Turnbull found it during restoration, she said, and someone tried to stop him from revealing it. Miss Lavinia's voice cracked. He had no right nitrogen monoxide right to unearth that monstrosity. Miss Marple nodded kindly. And yet, it tells a story, doesn't it? A very old story your family tried to bury. Miss Lavinia's lips quivered. For a moment, the steel in her spine faltered. Mrs. Fenton darted her eyes toward the door. Mr. Graves reached for his collar. Nora pressed a trembling hand to her chest. Miss Marple watched them all, eyes soft. Mind sharp. Very gently, Miss Marple said, Mr. Turnbull was attacked by someone with a reason to fear this portrait. Someone wearing cream satin dusted with lavender talc. A pin could have dropped and echoed like thunder. Mrs. Fenton froze. Miss Lavinia's eyes widened. Mr. Graves blinked rapidly. Nora gasped. Miss Marple let the silence stretch. Then, in the softest voice, almost a whisper, she added, but that person made a mistake. They believed this painting was the real threat. She nodded toward the second portrait. It is not. She leaned back, folding her hands neatly. The true threat was hidden elsewhere. The guilty person leaned forward unconsciously, instinctively wanting to know what they had missed. And Miss Marple watched. She saw the exact moment the mask cracked. The murderer leaned forward. First. Miss Marple did not reveal aloud what she saw. Not yet. She only said, I have found something that proves everything. I left it on the table behind me. She turned her head slightly, pointing toward a folded paper resting on a tall side table. The room held its breath. The murderer moved subtly, but unmistakably. A foot sliding, a hand tightening, a shift in posture, not toward the second portrait, not toward Nora, not toward Miss Marple, but toward that paper, the paper Miss Marple had deliberately left untouched. The paper, she had said, contained the truth. A lie, of course. There was nothing written there. But the guilty mind cannot resist the promise of damning evidence. The murderer lunged. Not dramatically, not wildly. Just a swift step toward the table. Too swift, too eager, too afraid. Miss Marple rose slowly. Thank you, she said gently, for confirming my suspicions. Constable Evans stared blankly. What? Who? What did they do? Miss Marple touched his arm. You saw it, Evans, she said kindly. Everyone did. Only one person believed the paper behind me held proof. Only one person feared its contents. Evans blinked, confused. But you didn't say what was in it. No, Miss Marple agreed. I did not. She faced the group, and yet someone believed it held the evidence that could expose them. Her eyes settled on the one person whose composure had shattered completely. One person who had leaned forward, moved too quickly, given themselves away. You, Miss Marple said softly. You have just revealed everything. The room erupted in shock. Mrs. Weatherby gasped. Nora cried out. Miss Lavinia stumbled backward. Mr. Graves nearly collapsed. Only the murderer stood still, chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. Eyes wide with realization. Miss Marple continued, voice firm now. You tried to stage the weeping portrait. You feared the second portrait. You attacked Mr. Turnbull. And you believed the paper behind me contained the final secret. She folded her hands gently. That secret is you. A suffocating silence filled the drawing room of Greymoor House. No one moved. No one breathed. Even the tick of the old mantel clock seemed to pause, as though time itself waited for Miss Marple's next words. The murderer stood frozen, eyes wide, posture rigid, caught not by force, but by truth. Miss Marple stepped forward gently, not triumphant, not dramatic, simply certain. Let us begin, she said softly, with the portrait that wept. Miss Marple faced the group. Folding her hands neatly, the portrait cried, she began. Not because of varnish or humidity, nor because of spirits. It cried because someone made it cry. Miss Lavinia gasped. Collapsing into her armchair, Miss Marple continued. A thin, sugary syrup was applied light enough to dry invisibly, but sticky enough that, when warmed by lanterns and a room full of people, it would liquefy and run down like a tear. Constable Evans blinked. You found syrup? Miss Marple nodded. At the bottom of the frame, and caught in that residue, was a tiny thread of cream satin dusted with lavender talc. Mrs. Fenton paled, her gloved fingers tightening. Many women wear lavender talc, she whispered. Indeed, Miss Marple agreed. But far fewer brushed against the portrait before midnight. She looked at the room, and only one woman took great care to approach the portrait unnoticed. A woman wearing cream satin. Nora Bell gulped. That night, Miss Marple said gently, you saw Mrs. Fenton slip near the portrait shortly before the unveiling. A stunned murmur rippled through the room. Mrs. Fenton trembled. I only wanted a closer look. I didn't doctor anything. You have no proof. Oh, but I do, Miss Marple replied softly. You proved it yourself. Miss Marple gestured toward the second portrait Arabella Greymore depicted in terror, a rope around her throat. This painting, she said, was the true threat. Painted by Miss Lavinia's mother, it shows Arabella not as she was romanticized, but as she died frightened and strangled. Miss Lavinia burst into tears. She didn't mean for anyone to see it, she cried. Mother tried to paint her grief away. She was distraught. Miss Marple touched her hand gently. I know. Your mother was a witness to tragedy, but she also left behind something else, her testament. Mr. Graves swallowed. I found the documents, he whispered. The codicil, the witness statement. And what did it say? Miss Marple, asked Graves, hesitated. Then, that Arabella had a child whose identity was concealed, a child who should have inherited the Greymore estate. Everyone gasped. Miss Marple nodded. That child was spirited away, raised in obscurity, but grew up knowing they had been denied something rightfully theirs. Her voice deepened slightly, but they also grew up angry. Miss Marple turned slowly toward the murderer. The motive, she said, was not hatred of Arabella. It was not greed, at least not initially. It was identity. The murderer flinched. You, my dear, Miss Marple continued gently, were Arabella's grandchild. A wave of shock swept the room. Arabella's child, the one hidden away, went on to have a daughter. That daughter grew up in Larkspur Hollow, unaware of her true heritage until recently. Miss Marple's gaze softened. You learned the truth only weeks ago. From whom? The murderer's lips trembled. Mr. Graves, they whispered. He found the documents. He showed me. Mr. Graves's face crumpled. I thought you had a right to know, Miss Marple nodded. Indeed. But you, she said to the murderer, did not react with calm reflection. You reacted with desperation. She raised a finger gently. You needed the village to suspect the Greymore family was cursed. You needed the portrait to become a spectacle, a distraction, so no one would discover the truth about the inheritance before you could secure it. Miss Marple turned to the constable when Mr. Turnbull discovered the second portrait, the truth about Arabella's death. You realized he posed a danger to your secret, someone who knew too much. Constable Evans swallowed. So they attacked him? Yes, Miss Marple said. And in the struggle, a piece of cream satin tore from the attacker's clothing. A piece I found on the workshop floor. She opened her handbag and placed the torn satin gently on the table. Cream satin dusted with lavender talc. The murderer closed there. Eyes dot the room knew. Miss Marple stepped closer. And, finally, she said, I had to be sure. So I set a trap. She gestured toward the empty sheet of paper she had placed behind her earlier. I told everyone that the paper contained proof of the killer's identity. Only someone who feared that truth would attempt to seize it. She looked directly at the murderer. You stepped forward before anyone else. You revealed your fear. You revealed yourself. The murderer's eyes filled with tears. Miss Marple spoke softly. The person who staged the weeping portrait, who feared the second painting, who attacked Mr. Turnbull, and who believed the inheritance was rightfully theirs, is Mrs. Fenton. The room erupted. Mrs. Fenton staggered backward, clutching the arm of a chair for support. No, she whispered. I didn't mean to hurt him. I only wanted what Arabella left behind. What should have come to my mother, and then to me. Miss Marple nodded kindly. You sought justice in your way, but you chose deception and violence. Mrs. Fenton sobbed. Arabella's child, my mother. She died with nothing but rumors. I thought if I could just raise a little doubt, stir the village, make the Grey Moors answer questions, someone would uncover the truth. Miss Marple sighed. But truth cannot be forced by schemes. It must be revealed with patience. Constable Evans stepped forward, placing a gentle but firm hand on Mrs. Fenton's shoulder. I'm afraid you must come with me. Mrs. Fenton did not resist as Mrs. Fenton was led away. Miss Lavinia wept softly, mourning not only the scandal, but the tragedy buried in her family's history. Miss Marple approached her gently. My dear, she said, your mother tried to protect Arabella's memory, and perhaps in doing so, she protected the child as well. Pain echoes across generations, but so does truth. Miss Lavinia nodded slowly. And justice? She whispered. Justice, Miss Marple said, is simply truth with consequences. She turned toward the window, where the midday sun streamed in with soft warmth. Another village mystery solved. Another tangle of human nature quietly set right. Larkspur Hollow settled into an uneasy calm in the days that followed. Not a perfect quiet, the sort of hush that follows a storm, when the air still crackles faintly, and the earth smells of rain, but a gradual, reluctant return to ordinary life. People still gathered in small knots near the post office or outside the bakery, speaking in low voices, shaking their heads, sighing dramatically. But as always, life moved on. It had to. The truth had finally loosened its grip on the village, but its echoes lingered. Mrs. Fenton left Larkspur Hollow 2 days after her confession. Not in handcuffs. Constable Evans had insisted that she would not be treated like a criminal, so long as Mr. Turnbull confirmed he would recover. She was taken instead to the county town for formal statements. Her house, once pristine and filled with lavender scent, stood empty. Curtains drawn, windows dark. Villagers whispered as they passed. A Grey Moor by blood, all along. Imagine her carrying that secret for years. No wonder she looked haunted. But others, quieter, kinder, murmured. She only wanted what her mother was denied. Life is cruel in the ways it chooses its victims. Miss Marple, overhearing both kinds of whispers as she strolled through the market square, reflected on how swiftly people judge what they do not fully understand. Mrs. Fenton had not been a villain, merely a wounded woman who chose the wrong path to seek her inheritance. Pain, Miss Marple knew, can twist itself into desperation. The restorer, Mr. Alec Turnbull, regained full consciousness by the 3rd morning. He complained of headaches, but declared himself fortunate, compared to the sort of fate Arabella nearly visited upon me via her portrait. Miss Marple visited him with a jar of marmalade. You took a terrible risk, she said kindly. He sighed. I only wanted the truth to be known. As did Mrs. Fenton, Miss Marple reminded him gently. But intentions, however noble, are easily lost in the tangle of secrets. Turnbull nodded gravely. I suppose I stirred an old fire, he murmured. one that still had embers. Indeed, Miss Marple said softly, but sometimes embers must cool on their own. Miss Lavinia Graymore retreated into the privacy of her home for a day and a night after the revelation. She allowed no visitors save Nora Bell, who brought her tea, and Miss Marple, who she reluctantly admitted, after much internal debate, that Miss Marple found her seated by her mother's old writing desk, the surface strewn with brittle papers and faded ink. My mother was trying to protect us, Miss Lavinia said, her voice trembling. She hid the truth because she thought it would tear our family apart. And in the end? Miss Marple asked softly. Miss Lavinia closed her eyes. It tore us anyway. Miss Marple touched her hand. Pain cannot be hidden forever, my dear. It blooms through cracks in the heart. Miss Lavinia sobbed once sharp, painful, but then straightened. I will restore Arabella's memory properly, she declared, with dignity, without lies. And what of Mrs. Fenton? Miss Marple asked gently. Miss Lavinia hesitated. I must think on that, she whispered. Justice is one thing. Forgiveness, quite another. Miss Marple nodded. She never hurried forgiveness. It had to be earned and chosen freely. Nora Bell, once timid and trembling, found an unexpected strength through the ordeal. Freed from suspicion, she carried herself with more confidence, still shy, but no longer frightened. She visited Miss Marple one afternoon with a basket of pastries. I never thanked you properly, she said. Cheeks red. That is quite all right, my dear. Nora shook her head. No, you believed me when others didn't. I won't forget that. Miss Marple smiled warmly. You have a good heart, Nora, and good hearts are easily bruised, but rarely broken. Nora blinked, eyes shimmering. I'll remember that, she whispered. There were now 2 portraits to contend with. The first, Arabella's sorrowful likeness, was moved to a smaller gallery room. Miss Lavinia ordered a plaque explaining Arabella's life not as a romantic mystery, but as a complex truth. A woman of beauty, burdens, and secrets. The second portrait, the one showing Arabella in terror, was carefully wrapped and placed in the Graymore archives. Not destroyed, as some insisted, nor displayed. Truth, Miss Lavinia said, should not be hidden, but neither should it be used for spectacle. Miss Marple approved. On the evening following Mrs. Fenton's departure, Miss Marple sat in her small cottage by the window, watching the last of the sunset burn orange against the rooftops. She knitted in soft silence, the needles clicking a familiar rhythm. Human nature, she mused, was like a tapestry. Threads of love woven with threads of hurt. Threads of pride twisted with threads of despair. Threads of truth tangled with threads of lies. And every now and then, a loose thread pulled free, revealing what lay beneath. People asked Miss Marple how she solved mysteries, how she found truths others overlooked. But she had never found the truth through grand gestures or shocks of intellect. She found it in people, their fears, their habits, their small, unguarded reactions, their desire always to hide pain. When Arabella's portrait wept, the village looked to ghosts, but Miss Marple looked to the living, and there she found the answer. As night fell, Miss Marple put away her knitting and closed the curtains. The village of Larkspur Hollow slept once more, peaceful though not untouched, for truth had finally come to rest. And Miss Marple, serene, allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. People, she murmured, are always so much more complicated than they seem. And with that timeless thought, she turned out the lamp, letting the soft darkness settle around her like an old friend. Early autumn settled over Larkspur Hollow with a hush, softening the edges of summer's memory. The hedgerows blushed into warm shades, and a faint chill threaded through the morning air, just enough for scarves to reappear and kettles to whistle more frequently. Life, as it always does, found its rhythm again. But the events surrounding Arabella Greymore's portrait had left fine. Lasting ripples across the village subtle, but unmistakable dot in the weeks that followed the scandal. Miss Lavinia Greymore transformed, not dramatically, nor in the manner of someone seeking redemption, but quietly. With intention. The rooms long kept closed were opened. The staff were encouraged to speak freely. Old records once locked behind keys were organized, cataloged, and made available for historical preservation. Most telling of all, Arabella's story was rewritten not as a whispered scandal or tragedy, but as a factual and compassionate narrative. A woman who had suffered misfortune, concealed a child, and died under circumstances the family chose to misunderstand. A portrait no longer wept in the gallery, but rather stood dignified, still and truthful. Miss Lavinia, though still sharp-tongued, carried herself with a softened air. Humility, Miss Marple noticed, often arrived late in life, but when it did, it settled like a blessing. One crisp morning, Miss Marple received an envelope from the county town. The handwriting was familiar, elegant, slanted. Too careful. Mrs. Fenton. Miss Marple opened it gently. Dear Miss Marple, I have begun to understand the difference between justice and vengeance. You are right. Pain passed down from one generation to the next becomes poison unless faced honestly. I will not return to Larkspur Hollow, but I will try to build a life that honors what my mother endured, without bitterness shaping my choices. Thank you for seeing me, even in my worst moments. Yours sincerely, Clara Fenton. Miss Marple folded the letter softly. Redemption, she reflected, rarely arrives loudly. It comes in quiet sentences and trembling handwriting. Nora Bell continued to grow in confidence. Miss Lavinia, recognizing the girl's loyalty, promoted her from maid to personal assistant, even entrusting her with tasks involving financial records and correspondence. One afternoon, Nora stopped Miss Marple in the village lane. I've signed up for evening classes, she announced proudly. Bookkeeping and clerical training. Miss Marple beamed. Oh, my dear, that is wonderful news. Nora smiled shyly. You taught me that fear shouldn't decide my future. Indeed not, Miss Marple agreed. Courage begins in such small moments. Nora hesitated, then hugged her. Miss Marple, startled but touched, hugged back. Mr. Graves delivered the restored Greymore documents to Miss Lavinia with solemn respect. His involvement in the affair had weighed heavily, though he had only sought to preserve history. Miss Marple visited him days later, finding him surrounded by stacks of old maps and quill-written records. I suppose, Mr. Graves said, that some histories were meant to be found. Miss Marple nodded. Every truth has its time. And its cost, he added softly. Yes, Miss Marple agreed. But sometimes the cost is a new kind of freedom. He smiled faintly at that. One evening, under a sky streaked with gold and lavender, Miss Marple took a gentle walk toward the meadow near the church. Autumn leaves crunched softly beneath her feet. She paused beneath the old oak tree, the one that had stood longer than any resident of Larkspur Hollow, and looked back at the village. Children played in the lanes. The bakery door swung open and shut with cheerful bustle. Evening lamps glowed warm in the cottages. Peaceful. Ordinary. Alive. She reflected on the case, not for its drama, but for what it revealed. Pain threads through families like a hidden seam. Secrets grow heavy when carried alone. Human nature so messy, so fragile, always finds a way to the surface. And truth, once uncovered, brings both heartache and healing. Miss Marple had seen much in her years. Great horrors, small cruelties, quiet kindnesses. But always she believed in one universal truth. Most crimes, at their root, begin with sorrow, and most resolutions, in the end, are seeds of hope. She breathed in the crisp evening air, letting it settle gently around her. Life, she murmured, is remarkably good at beginning again. With a contented sigh, she turned toward home, her steps slow but steady. Her heart was full, her mind peaceful, her spirit calm. And as the first star shimmered overhead, Miss Marple smiled, knowing Larkspur Hollow would rest tonight in quiet Grace Dot. Thank you for joining us in Larkspur Hollow. If you love mysteries wrapped in calm storytelling and sharp deduction, subscribe to the channel and turn on the bell so you never miss the next case.